TARASS BOOLBA, Nicholas Gogol. 3. TARASS BOOLBA and his sons had remained already more than a week at the Ssiecha. Ostap and Andrew had not yet much profited by warlike exercises. The Zaporoghians did not like spending their time in the mimicry of war. The education and martial accomplishments of the young were acquired by experience alone during the raging of battles, which, for the same reason, were almost incessant. The Cossacks found it dull work to employ their leisure in learning discipline, and if they ever studied anything, it was shooting at a target, and sometimes pursuing on horseback the wild animals of the steppes. The whole remaining time was given up to carousing, the proof of a widely diffused freedom. The whole Ssiecha presented a strange scene. It was like an unceasing festival, a banquet which had begun noisily and forgotten to end. Some Zaporoghians were occupied in different handicrafts, others had shops and busied themselves with trade, but the greater part feasted from morning till night, as long as the possibility of feasting jingled in their pockets, and as long as the conquered booty had not found its way into the hands of the tradesmen and the proprietors of brandy shops. This universal festival had something seductive about it. It was not an assembly of men who had been driven to drunkenness by grief. It was nothing but the maddest expression of mirth. Everyone who had found his way thither forgot and at once cast off everything which had till then occupied his mind. He seemed to drive away all his past life and to give himself up, soul and body, with the fanaticism of a new convert, to freedom and to comradeship, with men who, like himself, had no relations, nor home, nor family, and to whom nothing was left but the canopy of heaven and the unintermittent festival of their hearts. This gave rise to that mad gaiety which could never have found any other source. The tales and narratives which might be heard among the groups lazily reclining upon the ground were often so droll and breathed such lively animation that one must needs have had the immovable features of a Zaporoghian to have kept an indifferent countenance and never so much as curled the lip. And this, indeed, is one of the most striking features which distinguish the southern Russian from the rest of the Russians. The mirth was provoked by wine, was attended by noise, but yet there were none of those disfigured outlines of a caricatured gaiety which one finds in the dirty brandy shop. It was the friendly circle of schoolfellows. The only difference consisted in this, that instead of poring over books and listening to the stupid lessons of professors, these schoolfellows made invasions, mounted on about 5,000 horses, that instead of the field in which they had formerly played at ball, they now had, unguarded and uncared for, boundaries beyond which might be seen the swift head of the Tartar, and the Turk haughtily glancing from beneath his green turban. The difference was this, that instead of the forced will which had brought them together at school, they had, of their own free choice, left their fathers and mothers, and fled from the parental roof. Here were to be found those who had already felt the halter dangling about their necks, and who, instead of pale-faced death, had found life, and life in its utmost gaiety. Here were those who followed the noble principle of never retaining a farthing about them. Here were those who, thanks to the Jews, tenants of Polish lords, could always have their pockets turned inside out without the fear of losing anything. Here were all the collegians, who had not had the patience to endure the college rods, and who, of all their school learning, had not retained so much as the alphabet. But besides these, here were to be found some who knew who Horace was, who Cicero, and what the Roman Republic. Here were many who afterwards acquired distinction as officers in the army of the King of Poland. Here were many experienced volunteers who felt the noble conviction that it was quite the same thing where and why the war took place, so that wars were made, and that no man of noble feelings could remain without fighting. Many more were here who had come into the Ssiecha for no other purpose, but that they might say afterwards that they had been there and that they were hardened warriors. But what indeed were the characters that could not be found here? Those who liked warfare, who liked gilded cups, who liked rich stuffs or gold and silver coins, could at all times find employment here. Those only who worshipped womankind could find nothing to suit their taste, for no woman was allowed so much as to show her face even in the suburb of the Ssiecha. During their abode in the Ssiecha, Ostap and Andrew were much astonished at seeing that crowds of people came, without so much as anyone asking whence they came or what were their names. They came thither as if they were returning to their own homes which they had but recently quitted. The newcomer only went to the Koschevoi ataman, who addressed him in these terms. "Good day. Dost thou believe in Christ?" "I do," answered the newcomer. "And dost thou believe in the Holy Trinity?" "I do." "And dost thou go to church?" "I do." "Make the sign of the cross." The newcomer made it. "Well," said the Koschevoi, "thou mayest go into whichever kuren thou pleasest." And thus the ceremony ended. The whole population of the Ssiecha went to the same church, which they were ready to defend to the last drop of their blood, and yet the Cossacks would never attend to fasts and abstinence. The suburb was chiefly inhabited by Jews, Armenians, and Tartars, who, incited by the love of gain, dared to live and to have shops there, knowing that the Zaporoghians never bargained, but paid as much money as their hands took out of their pockets. But the fate of these greedy tradespeople was much to be pitied. They were like those who build their houses at the foot of Vesuvius. As soon as the Zaporoghians had no money left, the most desperate among them pillaged the shops and carried away everything without payment. The Ssiecha consisted of upwards of 60 kurens, which were very like so many independent republics, and still more like so many boarding schools. No one provided any furniture or food for himself. The kurenoi ataman had charge of everything, and was called on this account father. He kept the money, the clothes, the furniture, the flour, the oats, and even the fuel. All money was deposited with him. It was no rare occurrence that one kuren quarrelled with another. On such occasions, fighting immediately ensued. The rival kurens rushed into the field and fought till one of them got the upper hand, and then all ended in a general carouse. Such was this Ssiecha, which had so many attractions for young men. Ostap and Andrew plunged at once, with the heedlessness of youth, into this sea of pleasure, forgetting in no time their father's roof, the college, and all that had till then occupied their thoughts, and they gave themselves entirely up to this new mode of life. Everything was strange to them, the loose habits of the Ssiecha, its unsophisticated laws and administration, which even then seemed to them too severe in such a self-willed community. If a Cossack had committed theft, were it but of the most insignificant rubbish, his fault was reputed to be a shame to the whole community. He was, as a dishonourable person, tied to a pillory, and beside him was placed a club, with which everyone who passed by might give him a blow until the criminal expired. An insolvent debtor was fastened to a cannon and remained there till some of his comrades ransomed him and paid his debts. But the greatest impression made on Andrew was produced by the terrible penalty prescribed for murder. Before his eyes, a hole was dug in the ground, the murderer was put into it alive, and over him was placed the coffin containing the corpse of the man whom he had murdered. Then both were covered with earth, and the hole was filled up. For a long time, the dreadful ceremony of this punishment haunted Andrew, and he thought he saw again and again the man buried alive with the terrible coffin. Both youths soon gained the best repute among the Cossacks. Often did they go together with some comrades of their kuren, sometimes with the whole kuren, and with other kurens too, to shoot in the steppes an innumerable quantity of wild birds, stags, and goats. Or they resorted to the lakes, rivers, and arms of the Dnieper, assigned to every kuren by lot, to throw their fishing nets and bring to land a rich booty of fish sufficient to feed the whole kuren. It was not as yet a trial of true Cossack life, but still they succeeded in distinguishing themselves from among other youths by their audacity and their dexterity in everything. They never missed their aim when shooting, and they swam across the Dnieper against the current, an exploit for which every newcomer was triumphantly admitted into the assemblies of the Cossacks. But Taras was preparing a new scene of action for them. He did not like this idle mode of life. He desired real activity for them. After ruminating for a while how to raise the Ssiecha on some daring enterprise where one might find true knightly exploits to perform, he, at last, went one day to the Koschevoi and said to him abruptly, Koshevoi, it is high time for the Zaporoghians to take the air in the field. There is nowhere to take it, answered the Koshevoi, taking his pipe out of his mouth and spitting on one side. How so? Nowhere. There are the Turks, there are the Tartars. We cannot go either against Turks or against Tartars, answered the Koshevoi, coolly resuming his pipe. And why not? So it is. We have promised peace to the Sultan. But is he not an unbeliever? Well, do not the scriptures order us to combat all unbelievers? We have no right to do it. Had we not sworn by our faith, well, maybe we might have done it. But now, no, we cannot. Why can we not? Why dost thou say we have no right? Here have I 2 sons, both of them young men. Neither the one nor the other have ever seen war, and thou sayest, we have no right. And thou sayest, the Zaporoghians cannot go to war. So it must be. So then, the Cossacks' strength must run to seed. So men must end their lives like so many dogs, without having been of any use to their country or to Christendom. What do we live for, then? What the devil is the use of our life? Tell me that. Thou art a sensible man. There was some reason for electing thee, Koshevoi. Tell me, what do we live for? The Koshevoi left the question unanswered. He was a stubborn Cossack. He remained silent for a while, and then said, Nevertheless, there can be no war. So there will be no war, once more asked Taras. No. So it is of no use to think of it? It is of no use. Well, wait a little, thou devil's fist, said Boolba to himself. I'll teach thee to know me. And he resolved on the spot to take his revenge of the Koshevoi. After having talked first with one and then another, he made up a drinking party, and a number of tipsy Cossacks rushed to the public square. Here, tied to a pole, were the kettle drums, which were used for summoning the Rada, but not finding the sticks, which were in charge of an official called Dubish, they caught up logs of wood and began beating the drums with them. The first who appeared on hearing the sound of the drums was the Dubish, a tall one-eyed man, whose only eye was still very sleepy. Who dares to beat the drum? Cried he. Be silent. Take thy sticks, and beat the drum when thou art ordered to do so, answered the tipsy elders. The Dubish complied at once, and took out the sticks which he had brought in his pocket, being well acquainted with the usual end of such occurrences. The kettle drums resounded, and soon dark crowds of Zaporoghians were seen swarming like bees into the square. All assembled in a circle, and after the third beating of the drum came at last the chiefs, the Koshevoi with the mace, token of his dignity, the judge with the seal of the Ssiecha, the secretary with his inkstand, and the assaul with the staff. The Koshevoi and the other dignitaries took off their caps and bowed on every side to the Cossacks, who stood haughtily holding their arms akimbo. What means this assembly? What do you wish, gentlemen? Said the Koshevoi. Clamours and scolding words put a stop to his speech. Lay down thy mace. Lay it down directly, devil's son. We do not want thee any more, shrieked some Cossacks from the crowd. Some of the sober Kurans seemed to resist, but tipsy and sober Kurans came to blows. The shouts and noise became general. The Koshevoi tried to speak, but knowing that the infuriated, self-willed crowd might perhaps beat him to death for it, and that such was almost always the end of such riots, he bowed very low, laid down the mace, and disappeared among the people. Do you order, gentlemen, that we too lay down the tokens of our rank? Said the judge, the secretary, and the assaul, ready to resign the seal, the inkstand, and the staff. Not you. You may remain. We only wanted to drive away the Koshevoi because he is an old woman, and we need a man for a Koshevoi. Whom will you choose for your Koshevoi? Asked the dignitaries. Choose Kukubenko, cried one side. We will not have Kukubenko, cried the other. 'Tis early for him, his mother's milk is yet wet upon his lips. Let Shiloh be the ataman, cried some. Shiloh must be Koshevoi. Away with Shiloh, shouted the angry crowd. Is he a Cossack, to have thieved like a Tartar, the dog's son, aye to the devil with the drunkard Shiloh? Let us choose Borodati, Borodati. We will not have Borodati, a curse upon Borodati. Shout for Kirdiaga, whispered TARASS BOOLBA. Kirdiaga, Kirdiaga, shouted the crowd. Borodati, Borodati, Kirdiaga, Kirdiaga. Shiloh. The devil take Shiloh. Kirdiaga. Each of the proposed candidates, on hearing his name shouted, instantly quitted the crowd to leave no room for suspecting his personal influence in the election. Kirdiaga, Kirdiaga, was heard above all. Borodati. Blows succeeded to words, and Kirdiaga's party got the better. Go and fetch Kirdiaga, was now the cry. Some 10 Cossacks directly stepped out of the crowd. Many of them hardly stood upon their legs, such was the strength of the spirits they had swallowed. They went straight to Kirdiaga to notify to him his election. Kirdiaga, a clever old Cossack, had already been some time seated in his kuren, and looked as if quite unconscious of what had just taken place. "What do you want, gentlemen?" asked he. "Go. Thou art elected to be the Koschevoi." "Be merciful, gentlemen," said Kirdiaga. "I am by no means worthy of such an honor. I have not sense enough for a rank like that. Is there no one better than I to be found in the whole Ssiecha?" "Go when thou art told to go," cried the Zaporoghians. 2 of them took hold of his arms, and in vain did he endeavor to stay his feet. He was at last brought into the square, pushed from behind by blows and pokes, receiving such scoldings and admonitions as, "Don't draw back, thou devil's son. Take the honor, dog, when they give it to thee." In such a manner, Kirdiaga was brought into the midst of the Cossack circle. "Gentlemen," cried those who had brought him, "are you willing to have this Cossack for your Koschevoi?" "We are, all of us," shouted the crowd, and the field resounded far and wide with the cry. One of the elders took up the mace and offered it to the newly elected Koschevoi. Kirdiaga refused it, according to custom. The elder offered it a second time. Kirdiaga refused it again, and only after the 3rd invitation did he take up the mace. A clamor of approval arose from the crowd, and again far and wide the field resounded with the Cossacks' shout. Now stepped out from the midst of the people 4 of the oldest Cossacks, with grey crown locks and grey mustachios. No very old folks were to be found in the Ssiecha, for no Zaporoghian ever died a natural death. Each of them took a handful of earth, which recent rain had turned to mud, and put it upon Kirdiaga's head. Down from his head ran the wet earth, which flowed over his mustachios and cheeks, and soiled all his face with mud. But Kirdiaga remained standing upright, and returned thanks to the Cossacks for the honor they had bestowed upon him. So ended the clamorous election. It remains unknown whether others rejoiced in it as much as Boolba. First, for having taken his revenge on the late Koschevoi, and secondly, because Kirdiaga was his old comrade, who had been with him in the same campaigns, over sea and land, and had shared the same hardships and labors of warfare. The crowd dispersed immediately in order to rejoice over the election, and a revel ensued, such as Ostap and Andrew had not yet seen. The brandy shops were ransacked. Mead, brandy, and beer were carried off without any payment being made. The masters of the shops were glad to be suffered to escape untouched. The whole of the night passed in noise and songs, and the moon, rising in the sky, shone for a long time over the hands of musicians walking about the streets with banduras, torbands, and round balalaikas, and over the group of the singers who were kept in the Ssiecha to chant in the church and to sing the praises of the feats of the Zaporoghians. At last, tipsiness and fatigue began to get the better of the strong heads, and now began to be seen here and there a Cossack rolling on the ground. Here 2 comrades, embracing one another, have grown sentimental and both roll down weeping. There a whole crowd has lain down together. There is one who, after fidgeting very much about the most commodious manner of lying down, has stretched himself full length on a log. The last, whose head was somewhat stronger, remained still uttering incoherent sentences. But he, too, finished by submitting to the effects of brandy, and when he fell like the rest, the whole of the Ssiecha was asleep. 4. The very next day, TARASS BOOLBA was already in consultation with the new Koshavoy how to raise the Zaporoghians on some war business. The Koshavoy was a clever, cunning Cossack. He knew the Zaporoghians from top to toe, and at once said, "We cannot infringe our oath. We cannot on any account." But after having kept silence for some time, he added, "Never mind, we can. We will keep our oath, but we will find out something or other. Manage somehow to get the people together, not, however, in my name, but as if of their own free will. You understand how to do it, and we, with the other dignitaries, will rush into the square as if we knew nothing of the matter." Scarcely an hour had passed since this conversation, when on a sudden the kettle drums were beaten. All the Cossacks, the slightly tipsy, as well as those who had not yet recovered their senses, appeared at once. Thousands of Cossack caps all at once covered the square. A rumor arose. "What's the matter? Why did they beat the call? On what account?" At last, here and there were to be heard sentences. "Why is the Cossack's strength to be lost? Why is there no war? The officials only think of fattening themselves. Righteousness seems to have left the world. Other Cossacks began by listening, and then joined in also. Truly, there is no righteousness in the world." The officials seemed astonished at hearing such things. At last the Koshavoy stepped forward and said, "Gentlemen Zaporoghians, will you let me make a speech? My speech will be, gentlemen, about this, but maybe you know it better yourselves, that many Zaporoghians have gone into debt in the brandy shops, to Jews as well as to their comrades, and into such debt that no devil will now give credit to anyone. Then, again, my speech is about this, that there are many lads who have never so much as seen what war is, whereas you know, gentlemen, that no young man can ever remain without war. What kind of Zaporoghian is he who has never, not even once, vanquished an unbeliever?" "He speaks well," thought Bulba. "But do not think, gentlemen, that I am now speaking for the purpose of breaking peace. God forbid! I am only just mentioning facts. Now, with respect to God's temple, it is sinful to tell in what a state it is. Thanks be to God, the Ssiecha has now stood for so many years, and yet till now I do not speak of the exterior of the church, but even the images inside have no decorations. No one has ever thought to have even a silver cloth put upon any one of them. The church has only received that which was bequeathed to it by certain Cossacks, but even these donations were very poor, for the donors during their lifetime had spent everything they had in brandy. But all this I do not tell you to induce you to begin war against the misbelievers. We have promised peace to the Sultan, and it would be a great sin not to keep it, because we have sworn by our faith." "What does he mean by all this nonsense?" said Bulba to himself. "So, gentlemen, you see that we cannot begin war. Knightly honor forbids it. But according to my poor understanding, what I should say is this. Let us send the young people in our boats. Let them take a run on the coasts of Anatolia. What do you think of that, gentlemen?" "Let us all go," cried the crowd on every side. "Every one of us is ready to die for our faith." The Koshavoy was alarmed. He had not at all meant to have raised the whole Ssiecha. He thought it unfair to break the peace. "Let me, gentlemen, say a few words more." "Enough!" shouted the Zaporoghians. "Thou wilt say nothing better. If such be your will, well, you must have it. I am but the servant of your will. It is well known that the voice of the people is the voice of God. Nothing better can be settled than what the whole of the Ssiecha has settled. I consider only this. You know, gentlemen, that the Sultan will not fail to take his revenge for the pleasure that the lads will have. And in the meanwhile we should have kept ourselves in readiness. Our forces should have been fresh, and we should have feared nobody. While now, during our absence, the Tartars may fall on the Ssiecha. Tartars are nothing but Turkish dogs. They do not fall on you face to face, and will not come into the house so long as the master is at home. But they may bite our heels from behind, and painfully may they bite us. And, as we are now about this matter, to speak the truth, we have not enough boats, and the store of powder is not sufficient if all of us are to go. However, I am ready. I am happy to be the servant of your will." The cunning ataman stopped. Groups began to confer together. The atamans of the Kurans held council, and, as luckily few remained tipsy, all agreed to follow the prudent course. Immediately some of the men crossed the Dnieper to fetch the treasure of the Ssiecha and part of the arms taken from their enemies. They were kept in inaccessible hiding places, in the reeds along the banks of the river. All the other Cossacks rushed to the boats to inspect them and to put them in readiness for use. In a minute the banks of the river were covered with people. Carpenters came with axes in their hands, young Zaporoghians as well as elderly ones, the latter sunburnt, broad-shouldered, thick-footed, with grey hair in their mustachios, stood knee-deep in the water and dragged the boats into the river by means of strong cords. Others were bringing timber and balks ready dried. Here some were nailing planks on a boat. There a boat, keel upwards, was being caulked and pitched. In another place, according to the Cossack custom, long bundles of reeds were bound to the sides of the boats, to prevent them from being capsized by the sea waves. And still farther, all along the river fires were kindled and tar-boiled in copper kettles for tarring the boats. The experienced and elderly Cossacks gave their advice to the young ones. Noise and clamours arose from every side. The banks of the river were all alive with the stir and bustle. At this moment, a great ferry-boat came near the island. The men who were standing in it had already, at a distance, begun to wave their arms. They were Cossacks and dressed in coats falling to rags. The miserable dress which they wore, some of them had nothing about them but their shirt and a short pipe in their mouth, showed at once that they had recently escaped from misfortune, or that they had been feasting until they had spent all that they had about their persons. From among them came forward a short, thick-set, broad-shouldered Cossack, some 50 years old. He shrieked louder than any and waved his arms in the most discordant manner. But the cries and the talking of the workmen prevented him from being heard. "What brings you here?" asked the Koschevoi, while the ferry-boat was landing. All the workmen, stopping in their work with raised axes and other instruments, looked on in expectation. "Misfortune!" shouted the thick-set Cossack from the ferry-boat. "What misfortune?" "Gentlemen Zaporoghians, let me address you." "Speak on." "Or maybe you wish to convoke a Rada." "Speak, we are all here," cried the people with one accord. "Have you, then, heard nothing about what has happened in the hetman's dominions?" "And what is the matter there?" asked the ataman of one of the Kurans. "What is the matter? It seems the Tartars must have well boxed your ears that you heard nothing." "Tell, then, what did happen there?" "Such things have happened that, since you were born and christened, you never saw the like of them." "Speak, then, at once, and say what has happened, thou son of a dog," cried one among the crowd, losing patience. "Such times are come that even the holy churches are no longer ours." "How so?" "Jews are made landlords thereof. If one does not pay the toll to the Jew, no mass can be performed." "What nonsense art thou saying?" "And if the cursed Jew does not put, with his damned finger, a mark upon the holy Passover, the Passover cannot be consecrated." "He lies, gentlemen brothers. This cannot be, that an unclean Jew should put a sign upon the holy Passover." "Listen, only. I have more to tell you. The Latin priests now drive over all Ukraine in chariots, but the evil is not in their driving in chariots. The evil is in the chariots being no longer drawn by horses, but by Orthodox Christians. Hear me, I have more to tell you. They say that Jewesses are now making themselves petticoats out of our priests' vestments. These are the things that happen in Ukraine, gentlemen, and you are here resting and carousing in your Ssiecha. Truly, it seems the Tartars have put you into such a fright that you have no eyes left to see, no ears to hear what passes in the world." "Stop! Stop!" interfered the Koschevoi, who had remained standing with his eyes fixed upon the ground, as well as all the Zaporoghians, who in important business never obeyed the first impulse, but kept silent, and in their silence gathered the stern force of indignation. "Stop! Let me say my word too. And what did you do? You, may your father be beaten by the devil. Had you no sabres then? Had you none? How did you let such profanations happen?" How did we let such profanations happen? I should like to have seen you try to stop them when there were 50,000 Poles, and, there is no use to conceal it, when there were some among us, the cursed dogs, who went over to the Polish faith too. And your hetman, and your colonels, what did they do? Our colonels did such doings, that God forbid anyone else should do the same. How so? Why, so that the hetman now lies roasted in a copper ox at Warsaw, and the arms and heads of our colonels are carried to the fairs to be shown to the people. Such were the doings of our colonels. A shudder of horror ran through the whole crowd. A moment's silence reigned among it, like that which immediately precedes a terrible storm. Then, all at once, a murmur arose, and everyone gave vent to his indignation. Jews renting Christian churches, popish priests to be driving about on Orthodox Christians, such torments to be suffered on Russian soil from accursed papists, so to treat the hetman and the colonels. This must not be. This shall not be. Speeches of this kind were heard on all sides. The Zaporoghians went on shouting and felt their strength. It was no longer the hum of a giddy people. Strong and heavy characters were now aroused, who, if they were long before turning red-hot, yet, when once red-hot, kept their internal heat a long time. "Let us hang all the Jews," cried a voice from the crowd. "Let them not make petticoats for their Jewesses out of our priests' robes. Let them not put signs on holy Passovers. We will drown all the accursed race in the Dnieper." These words, uttered by someone from the crowd, flew like lightning from one to another, and the people rushed to the suburb with the intention of putting all the Jews to death. The poor sons of Israel, losing the last remains of their almost always diminutive spirit, hid themselves in empty brandy casks, in ovens, and even crept under the petticoats of their Jewesses. But the Cossacks found them out everywhere. "Most illustrious gentlemen," shouted a Jew, as tall and as long as a hop-pole, thrusting forth his miserable face, all contorted by fright, from amidst a group of his comrades. "Most illustrious gentlemen, let us tell you only one word. We will tell you such a thing as you never heard of before. Such an important thing that words cannot say how important it is." "Let them say it," said Bulba, who always liked to give a hearing to the accused party. "Most serene gentlemen," said the Jew. "Such gentlemen nobody ever saw before, by heavens, never. Such good, such kind, such brave gentlemen never were before in the world." His voice was choked and trembling with fear. How could it be that we should ever have thought anything bad about the Zaporoghians? Those that are renting churches in Ukraine are not our people at all. By heavens, they are not ours. They are no Jews. The devil knows what they are. They are people worthy to be spit at, and nothing more. Here are witnesses for me. Say I not true, Ssiecha, or thou, Shmuel? "By heavens, so it is," answered Ssiecha and Shmuel, both in ragged caps, and both pale as chalk from fright. "We have never yet been on the side of your enemies," continued the tall Jew, "and as for the papists, we do not even wish to know them. May the devil haunt their sleep. We are for the Zaporoghians, like bosom brothers." "You, the brother of the Zaporoghians," said one from the crowd. "That will never be, cursed Jews. Gentlemen, into the Dnieper with them all. Let us drown every one of the accursed race." These words were the signal for seizing the Jews and throwing them into the river. Pitiful shrieks resounded on every side, but the stern Zaporoghians only laughed as they saw the Jews' slippered feet beating the air. The poor orator, who had called down this storm upon his own head, jumped out of his coat, which someone had already laid hold of, and left in a dirty, tight waistcoat, grasped the feet of Bulba, and in a whining voice entreated him. "Mighty lord, most illustrious lord, I knew your brother, the late lamented Dorosh. He was a warrior who was an ornament to all chivalry. It was I who gave him 800 sequins when he stood in need of his ransom from the Turks." "Didst thou know my brother?" asked Taras. "By heavens, I knew him. A generous lord was he." "What is thy name?" "Yankel." "Very well," said Taras. Then, after thinking for a while, he turned towards the Cossacks and said, If we want to do it, we shall always find time to hang the Jew, but for the present let me have him." After which Taras took him to his chariots, which were guarded by his own Cossacks. "Crawl under that wagon, lie there and do not move, and you, my lads, keep watch over the Jew." Having said this, he repaired to the square where the crowd had been for some time assembling. They had all with one accord left off mending the boats, as the campaign now impending was to be led over land, and instead of boats, chariots and steeds were now required. Now all, both young and old, were to take the field, and by a decision of the elders, of the atamans, of all the kurens, and of the Koschevoi, as well as by the common assent of all the Zaporoghian Ssiecha, it was resolved to push straight into Poland and to avenge the sufferings and humiliation of the Cossacks' religion and glory, to pillage every town, set fire to every hamlet and every cornfield, and make the Cossack name once more renowned over all the steppes. Everyone donned his war dress and armour. The Koschevoi seemed suddenly to have grown to double his former size. He was no longer the flattering accomplisher of the giddy wishes of a free people. He was now the commander with unlimited authority. He was a despot who knew but to command. All the knights, lately so self-willed and idle, now stood arrayed in ranks, with their heads respectfully bent, not daring so much as to lift their eyes while he was giving his orders without any noise or haste, but slowly and composedly, as an old and experienced master of his art, who had more than once accomplished feats cleverly devised. Look well about you." Thus he spoke. "Put to rights the wagons and the tar-pail for pitching the wheels. Try your arms. Don't take much clothing, a shirt and 2 pairs of trousers for each Cossack, a pot of dried oatmeal, another of pounded millet. More than this no one must have. There will be plenty of provisions in the baggage wagons. Every Cossack must have a couple of horses. Then we must take some 200 bullocks, because bullocks will be required for passing fords and marshy places. And above all, gentlemen, keep order. I know there are some of you who, directly any booty falls into their hands, are quite ready to seize every rag of nankeen, just as well as costly stuffs, were it but to wrap up their feet. Leave off such devilish habits, throw away all the petticoats, and keep nothing but arms, if good ones come in your way, and gold and silver coins, because these are easy to carry, and may be wanted when the time comes. And now, gentlemen, I tell you beforehand, if anyone is found to be tipsy during the march, no trial will be allowed him. I will have him dragged to the wagons, and, whoever he may be, were he the bravest of the brave, he shall be shot on the spot and thrown without interment to the birds of prey, for a drunkard on march is not worthy of Christian burial. Young men, obey in everything the older ones. If anyone is touched by a bullet, or gets a sabre wound in the head, or anywhere else, don't pay too much attention to such trifles. Mix up a charge of powder in a dram of brandy, swallow it all at once, and all will be over. No fever will ensue. On a wound, if it be not too large, only put some earth, which ought to be first kneaded with spittle in the palm of the hand. The wound will dry at once. Now, to business. My lads, to business, and no hurry." So spoke the Koschevoi, and as soon as he had done, all the Cossacks went to their business. The whole of the Ssiecha had all at once grown sober, and nowhere could have been found even one tipsy man, as if no such thing had ever existed among the Cossacks. Some mended the hoops of the wheels and put new axle-trees to the carts. Others brought sacks of provisions to the wagons. Some stowed away the arms. Others drove horses and bullocks. On all sides was heard the trampling of horses, the experimental firing of guns, the jingling of sabres, the bellowing of bullocks, the creaking of carts, the talk, the clamours, the shouts of the drivers. Presently the whole of the Cossack army drew up in line along the field, and he who attempted to run from its head to its tail would have had a long run before him. A priest was saying mass in the small wooden chapel. He sprinkled all the people with holy water. They all kissed the cross, and, as the army set in motion and was leaving the Ssiecha, all the Zaporoghians turned back their heads and said, almost in the same words, "Farewell, our mother. May God preserve thee from every impending evil." As Taras Bulba rode through the suburb, he saw that his Jew, Yankel, had already set up a tent and was selling flints, turnscrews, powder, and various other requisites of war likely to be needed on the way, even rolls and loaves. "What a devil of a Jew," thought Taras, and riding up to him said, "Fool, why art thou sitting here? Dost thou wish to be shot like a sparrow?" Yankel, instead of answering, drew nearer to him, and making a gesture with both his hands, as if he were about to disclose some mystery, said, "Let my lord only hold his peace, and not tell it to anyone. Among the Cossack wagons there is one which is mine. I bring every requisite provision for the Cossacks, and during the march I will sell everything at such reduced prices that no Jew has ever sold at such before. By heavens I will. By heavens." Taras Bulba shrugged his shoulders, astonished at the Jewish nature, and rode away to the army. 5. In a short time the whole of the southeast of Poland became a prey to terror. Everywhere the news had spread. "The Zaporoghians! The Zaporoghians are coming!" All those who could save themselves by flight used to run away in those times, so disordered, so astonishingly careless, when no fortresses, no castles were built, but when men set up some temporary thatched dwelling, thinking it useless to lose either money or labor on what was doomed to be destroyed in the next Tartar invasion. The alarm was general. One changed his oxen and his plough for a horse and a gun and repaired to the regiments. Another hid himself, driving away his cattle and carrying off everything possible. Now and then were to be found some who encountered the strangers with armed hands, but always with a bad result. The greater part hurriedly took flight. Everyone knew how hard it was to contend with the Zaporoghians, warriors hardened in warfare, and who, even in their self-willed license, kept a preconcerted order in battle. The mounted Cossacks rode without encumbering or overexerting the horses. The infantry steadily followed the wagons, and the whole army moved only during the night, taking rest by day in open places, uninhabited tracts and forests, of which there were then plenty. Spies were sent in advance to gather information and to reconnoiter, and oftentimes the Zaporoghians appeared where they were the least expected. Then the only thing was to bid farewell to life. The hamlets became the prey of flames. The cattle and horses, which could not be carried off by the Cossacks, were slaughtered on the spot. They seemed rather to be carousing than carrying on a campaign, but the hair would stand on end at the relation of the terrible feats of cruelty of those half-savage times which were everywhere accomplished by the Zaporoghians. Children were put to the sword, women's breasts cut away, the skin torn from the leg as far as the knee of those who were left free. Such was the terrible payment of the Cossacks for past debts. The abbot of a monastery, hearing of their approach, sent 2 monks to them to say they had no right to act thus, as the Zaporoghians and Poland were at peace, that they were infringing their duty towards the king and at the same time violating the law of nations. "Tell the reverend father from me and from all the Zaporoghians," answered the Koshevoy, "that he has nothing to fear. The Cossacks are as yet only just lighting their pipes." And soon after, the majestic abbey was enshrouded in devastating flames, and its gigantic Gothic windows looked with severe aspect through the occasionally disunited waves of the conflagration. Crowds of flying monks, Jews and women soon found those towns where there was any hope to find any protection in the number of the garrison and in the thickness of the walls. At times the government sent help, but these few detachments, coming too late, either could no longer find the Cossacks or took fright, turned back at the first encounter and fled away on their swift horses. It happened, however, that some of the king's captains, who had been victorious in previous battles, resolved to unite their strength and put a stop to the progress of the Zaporoghians. It was on such occasions that our young Cossacks were put to the trial. They were strangers to pillage, careless about booty or about fighting a weak foe, but they were inflamed with the desire of exhibiting their prowess before their older comrades, of fighting hand to hand with the brisk and boastful Pole, who came dashing upon his fiery steed, the flowing sleeves of his cloak flying behind him in the wind. The school was amusing to them. They had already taken a great many horse trappings, costly swords and guns. 1 month ago, they were but half-fledged nestlings. Their nature was now quite changed. They were grown men. Even their features, which till then had the meekness of youth, now bore a menacing and strongly marked expression. Old Taras was delighted to see both his sons always among the foremost. Ostap seemed to have been born to tread the path of war and to accomplish difficult feats of arms. Never losing his presence of mind, on no occasion alarmed, but with a coolness quite unnatural in a young man of 22, he understood at the first glance the whole of the danger and the position of things, and on the spot found the means of avoiding difficulty, but avoided it only to be the more sure of surmounting it. His movements were now stamped with the certainty of experience, and the propensities of the future captain might unerringly be traced in him. His body breathed forth strength. His knightly qualities already made him like the mighty lion. "Oh, that fellow will make in time a good colonel," said old Taras. "By heavens, he will be a good colonel, and such a one that he will excel his father." Andrew gave himself up to the bewitching music of bullets and swords. He understood not what it is to consider or to calculate or to measure the strength on one side and on the other. In battle he saw but a frantic luxury and delight. He found something festive in those moments when his brain was on fire, when everything glimmered confusedly before his eyes, when heads flew about, when horses fell with a crash on the ground, and he himself went galloping amidst the whistling of bullets and the clashing of swords, striking on every side and never feeling the strokes which he received. And old Taras more than once was amazed at seeing Andrew, induced only by his own vehemence, rush on such deeds as no cool-minded and reflective man would have ever undertaken, and achieve solely by the madness of the attack, which could not but astonish the oldest warriors. Old Taras wondered at Andrew and said, "This one, too, is a good warrior. May the fiend not take him. Not such a one as Ostap, but still a good, yes, a very good warrior." It was decided that the army should push its march straight to the city of Dubno, where, as the rumor went, there was much money and many rich inhabitants. The march was accomplished in a day and a half, and the Zaporoghians appeared under the walls of the town. The citizens resolved to defend it to the last, and preferred dying in the squares and in the streets before their houses to letting the foe enter their city. A high earthen rampart surrounded it. Where the rampart was lower, there projected a stone wall, or a house converted into a battery, or at least a strong wooden palisade. The garrison was strong, and felt the importance of its duty. The Zaporoghians at first rushed at the ramparts, but were stopped by murderous volleys of grape-shot. The burghers and citizens of the town seemed also not to wish to remain idle, and stood in crowds on the town wall. Their looks expressed the desperation of resistance. Even women took part in the contest, and stones, casks, and pots flew down on the Zaporoghians. Pitch and sacks of sand blinded their eyes. The Zaporoghians did not like fighting against fortresses. Sieges were not their business. The Koschevoi gave orders for a retreat and said, "Never mind, gentlemen brothers, let us withdraw, but may I be rather a cursed Tartar and not a Christian if we allow anyone to escape from the town. Let them, the dogs, perish, die hunger." The army, after retreating, surrounded the town, and having nothing to do, began to lay waste the country around, setting fire to the neighboring hamlets and cornricks, driving herds of horses into the unreaped cornfields, where, as if on purpose, stood the full waving ears, the produce of an abundant crop which this year had brought to all labourers. The besieged watched with horror the destruction of their means of subsistence. The Zaporoghians, in the meantime, drew up their wagons into 2 files all round the town, and, after dividing their encampment into kurens, as in the Ssiecha, played at leapfrog, at pitch and toss, and looked with killing coolness at the town. Bonfires were lighted at night. The cooks of each kuren boiled buckwheat in enormous copper kettles. Sleepless sentinels stood all night long by the bonfires. The Zaporoghians, however, soon began to grow weary of inactivity, principally from the tediousness of sobriety unconnected with any exertion. The Koschevoi found it even necessary to double the proportion of brandy, a practice sometimes used with the Cossacks when they were not engaged in any difficult enterprise. The young Cossacks, especially the sons of Taras Bulba, were displeased with this mode of life. Andrew evidently was overpowered by its dullness. "Stupid boy," said Taras to him. "The Cossack who knows how to wait becomes an ataman. He is not a good warrior who merely does not lose his presence of mind in danger, but he is a good warrior who does not become dull even in inactivity, and who, notwithstanding all impediments, will end by attaining his aim. But fiery youth is no match to an old man. Both have different natures, and both look with different eyes at the same thing." While the siege was going on, the regiment of Taras came to join the besiegers. The Isaul Tovkach brought it. Two more Isauls, the secretary, and the other officials of the regiment also came with it. The whole of this reinforcement numbered more than 4,000 Cossacks. Many of them were volunteers who had come of their own accord without being summoned as soon as they had heard of the impending business. The Isauls had been entrusted by the wife of Taras to bring her blessing to her sons and to forward to each of them a cypress image brought from one of the monasteries of Kiev. The two brothers hung the holy images round their necks and involuntarily gave way to their fancy at this remembrance of their old mother. What omen did this blessing bring them? Was it a blessing for vanquishing the foe and a pledge of their gay return to their native country with booty and glory, which should be the subject of eternal songs for the players of the bandoura? Or was it? But unknown is the future, and it stands before man like the autumn fog which rises over marshes. Birds are flying in it upwards and downwards, flapping their wings and seeing not one another. The dove without seeing the hawk without seeing the dove, and every one without knowing how near he may be to death. Ostap had long since resumed his occupations and was going to his kuren, but Andrew, without being able to account for it, felt a heaviness at his heart. The Cossacks had already finished their supper. Evening had long closed in, and a beautiful July night had encircled the earth in its embrace. Still, Andrew did not return to his kuren, did not go to sleep, but stood gazing at the picture before him. Numberless stars glimmered with a bright translucent twinkling over the skies. The field was covered with carts, placed without order, from which hung tar pots all dripping with tar. The carts were loaded with all the booty and provisions taken from the enemy. Near the carts, beneath the carts, and at a great distance from the carts, might be seen Zaporoghians sleeping on the grass in different picturesque attitudes. One had laid his head on a corn sack, another on his cap, a third had simply chosen the ribs of his comrade for his pillow. Almost everyone wore, suspended to his belt, a sabre, a matchlock, and a short pipe with brass plates, wires for cleaning it, and a steel for kindling fire. The massive bullocks were reclining with their feet under their bodies, and the great white spots which they formed looked at a distance like so many grey stones thrown about the acclivities of the field. From every spot in the grass the noisy snoring of the sleeping army had begun to rise, and it was answered from the field by the sonorous neighing of the horses, indignant at having their feet tied. A magnificent and terrific sight was now added to the beauty of the summer night. It was the blaze of the conflagration of the neighboring country. At one place the flames went slowly and majestically along the sky. At another, meeting with something combustible in their progress, they whirled suddenly round, hissed, and flew up to the very stars, and their fiery tongues disappeared in the most distant clouds. Here, a burnt cloister, blackened by the fire, stood like a hard-featured Carthusian monk, showing its stern, gloomy outlines at every blaze. Next to it, a garden was burning. It seemed as if one might hear how the trees hissed wrapped in smoke, and as the fire happened to catch some new place, its phosphoric violet light shone suddenly on the ripe bunches of plums or threw a brilliant golden hue on the yellow pears. And in the midst of all this was to be seen, dangling from the wall of the building or from the bough of a tree, the corpse of some poor Jew or monk, doomed, like the building itself, to become the prey of the flames. Over the conflagration, hovering far away, were to be seen birds looking like so many dark, diminutive crosses on a fiery field. The city seemed to be slumbering. Its spires, its roofs, its palisades, and its walls were sometimes illuminated by the reflection of the distant conflagration. Andrew walked round the Cossacks' encampment. The bonfires at which the sentries were sitting were going out, and the sentries had fallen asleep, having, it would seem, too much indulged their Cossack appetites. Andrew marvelled at such carelessness, and thought it lucky that no strong forces of the enemy were at hand, and that there was nothing to fear. At last he went to one of the carts, climbed into it, and lay down on his back, bending his arms backwards and putting them under his head. He could not yet sleep, and remained a long time looking at the sky. It appeared all open to him. The air was pure and transparent. The compact mass of stars forming the Milky Way seemed to be all overflowing with light. At times, Andrew felt a sort of oblivion and slumber, like a light fog hid for a minute the sky from his sight. But the next moment it cleared away, and again he saw the heavens. At this time, it seemed to him that a strange human face had passed before him. Thinking that it was nothing but an illusion of sleep which would disappear, he opened his eyes wider and saw that really an emaciated, dried-up face bent over him and looked straight into his eyes. Long and coal-black locks of hair, uncombed and dishevelled, stole from beneath a veil thrown over the head. The strange brightness of the eyes and the death-like swarthiness of the strongly marked features would almost have led to the supposition that it was a phantom. Andrew convulsively seized a matchlock and exclaimed, "Who art thou? If thou be an evil spirit, disappear. If thou be a human creature, thy joke is out of place. I'll kill thee at once." The figure answered only by putting its finger to its lips and seemed to be imploring silence. Andrew let go his hold and began to look attentively at it. The long hair, the neck, and brown, half-naked bosom showed it to be a woman, but she was not a native of the country. Her face was sunburnt and bespoke suffering. Her wide cheekbones stuck out over her shrunken cheeks. Her narrow eyes were cut obliquely, with the outer corner raised. The more Andrew looked at her features, the more he found in them something which he knew. At last he could not refrain from asking, "Tell me, who art thou? It seems to me that I know thee, or have seen thee somewhere." 2 years ago, in Kiev." 2 years ago, in Kiev," repeated Andrew, endeavouring to bring to mind all that his memory had retained of his collegian's life. He took once more an attentive survey of her, and suddenly exclaimed aloud, "Thou art the Tartar, the servant of that lady, of the voivoda's daughter." "Hush!" said the Tartar, imploringly, folding her hands, shuddering in all her frame, and at the same time turning her head to see that no one had been awakened by the shriek of Andrew. Tell me, why, wherefore art thou here?" said Andrew, in a whisper almost choked, and interrupted at every moment by his internal agitation. "Where is the lady? Is she alive?" "She is now in the town." "In the town?" exclaimed he, again almost shrieking aloud, and he felt that all his blood rushed at once to his heart. "Why is she in the town?" "Because the Lord, her father, is there. It is now more than a year that he has been voivoda in Dubno." "Well, is she married? Speak. How strange thou art. Say, what is she now?" "She has not eaten for 2 days." "How is that?" "For a long time not one of the citizens has had a piece of bread. It is long since they were all eating earth." Andrew remained speechless. "The lady saw thee among the Zaporoghians from the town wall. She said to me, 'Go, tell the knight that if he recollects me, he will come to me, and if not, that he will give thee a morsel of bread for my old mother, for I cannot see my mother die before my eyes. Let me rather die first, and she afterwards. Entreat him, embrace his knees and his feet. He too may have an old mother. For her sake he must give a bit of bread.'" Many and different were the feelings that awakened and stirred in the young Cossack's breast. "But how art thou here? How didst thou come?" "By a subterranean passage." "Is there any subterranean passage, then?" "Yes." "Where?" "Thou wilt not betray me, knight." "No, I swear by the Holy Cross." "Behind the ravine, after crossing the rivulet, where there are some reeds growing." "And it leads straight into the city?" "Straight into the cloister of the city." Let us go directly. But in the name of Christ and of his holy mother, a loaf of bread." "Thou shalt have it. Stay here by this cart, or rather lie down in it. Nobody will see thee. All are sleeping. I'll be back directly." And he went to the wagons where the provisions of his kuren were kept. His heart beat high. All the past which had been hidden, stifled by his present Cossack life and by the hardships of warfare, rose once more to the surface, drowning in return all the present. Again he saw emerging before him, as if from the depths of some ocean cavern, the form of the glorious lady. Again his memory brought back the recollection of her fine arms, of her eyes, of her smiling lips, of her thick, dark chestnut hair, whose locks hung curling over her bosom, and of all those elastic limbs which so well harmonized with her maidenly figure. No, these recollections were never extinguished in his breast. They had, only for a time, given place to other mighty impressions. But often had they disturbed the young Cossack's slumber, and often did he long lie sleepless on his bed, without knowing how to explain the cause of his sleeplessness. He went on, and his heart beat higher and higher, and his young knees shook at the mere thought of seeing her again. When he reached the wagons, he had entirely forgotten why he had come, and raising his hand to his brow, remained some time trying to recollect what he had to do. At last he shuddered and felt terror-stricken. The thought flashed across his mind that she might be dying from hunger. He rushed to one of the wagons and took some great rye loaves under his arm. But then he thought that this food, which suits the unspoiled taste of the strong Zaporoghians, would be too coarse and unsuited to her tender person. He remembered that, the day before, the Koschevoi had scolded the cooks for taking the whole of the buckwheat flour to make salamata, when the quantity would have been quite sufficient for more than 3 days. Certain of finding enough salamata left in the coppers, Andrew took the travelling kettle of his father and went with it to the cook of his kuren, who was sleeping beside 2 enormous cauldrons, under which the ashes were not yet extinguished. Looking into the cauldrons, he was astonished to find both of them empty. It ought to have required more than human exertions to eat up all their contents, the more so as their kuren was not so numerous as the others. He peeped into the kettles of the other kurens. There was nowhere anything left. Involuntarily he recollected the saying that Zaporoghians are like children. Is there but little food? They will eat it. Is there much? They will still leave nothing. What was to be done? There was yet somewhere, he thought, in the wagons of his father's regiment, a sack of white bread, which the Cossacks had found while pillaging the cloister kitchen. Andrew went straight to his father's wagon. The sack was not there. Ostap had taken it to rest his head upon, and stretched on the ground, he made the whole field resound with his snoring. Andrew, with one hand, seized the sack and pulled it away with a jerk, so that Ostap's head fell on the ground, and he himself started up in his sleep, and sitting with his eyes shut, shouted, "Hold! Hold! The devil of a Pole! Catch his horse! Catch it!" "Be silent, or thou art a dead man," cried the terrified Andrew, raising the sack on his head. But Ostap did not proceed with his speech, for he was already asleep, and snored with such violence that his breath waved the grass on which he was tying. Andrew looked warily round to ascertain if the ravings of Ostap had awakened any of the Cossacks. In fact, a crown-tufted head was seen rising in the nearest kuren, but, after looking around, it soon dropped on the ground. After waiting some 2 or 3 minutes, Andrew departed with his sack. The Tartar woman was crouching in the wagon, hardly daring to breathe. "Arise, let us begone. Everyone sleeps. Do not be afraid. Canst thou take but one of these loaves, if I cannot carry them all?" Saying this, he lifted the sacks upon his back, drew another sack with millet from a cart on his way, took even in his hands those loaves which he had wished the Tartar to carry, and bending a little, went boldly through the ranks of the sleeping Zaporoghians. "Andrew," said old Bulba, as Andrew was passing near him. Andrew's heart sank within him. He stopped trembling and slowly uttered, "What?" "There is a lass with thee. I'll give thee a famous thrashing tomorrow. The lasses will bring thee to no good." And thus saying, he reclined his head upon his elbow and began to scrutinize the veiled form of the Tartar. Andrew stood riveted to the spot, without daring to lift his eyes upon his father, But at last he raised them and looked at old Bulba. He saw him already sleeping, with his head resting on the palm of his hand. He made the sign of the cross. Fear quitted his heart still faster than it had overpowered it, and as he turned round to look at the Tartar, he saw her standing behind him like a dark granite statue, all muffled in her veil, and the glare of the distant conflagration, brightening into a sudden flash, lighted only her eyes, dull as those of a corpse. He pulled her sleeve, and both proceeded together, looking back at every step. Descending a declivity, they came at last to a ravine. At the bottom of which there rolled heavily along a rivulet overgrown with sedge, whose banks were all uneven. The field on which the Zaporoghian encampment stood was now entirely hidden from them. At least, as Andrew looked back, he saw an eminence, as high as a man's head, which rose behind him. On it were waving some blades of grass, over which the moon rose in the sky in the shape of a curved sickle of bright red gold. A light wind, which blew from the steppe, foreboded the approach of dawn, but nowhere was to be heard the distant crowing of the cock, for neither in the town nor in the surrounding country had a cock for a long time been left. They passed the rivulet on a log thrown across it. Beyond it rose the opposite shore, which seemed to be higher than that which they had left, and had a steep ascent. The wall was here lower, yet the spot seemed a sure stronghold, for behind it rose the cloister wall. The steep hill was covered with long grass, and in the narrow ravine between it and the rivulet grew reeds nearly as tall as a man. On the summit of the hill might be seen the remains of a palisade, which formerly enclosed a kitchen garden. Before it grew the large leaves of the butter bur, from behind which stuck out the goosefoot, wild prickly plants, and the sunflower, which reared its top above them. Here the Tartar took off her shoes and went barefoot, carefully lifting her dress, for the place was marshy and covered with water. Making their way through the reeds, they stopped before a heap of brushwood which formed a fascine. They removed it and found a sort of arch made of earth, whose opening was not wider than the opening of a fireplace. The Tartar, bending her head, went in first, then followed Andrew, stooping as much as he could to be able to carry his sacks. They were soon quite in the dark.